Clayton Reeves thought he'd inherited an empty cabin in the Colorado wilderness. Instead, he found 5 beautiful women claiming it as their sanctuary, and the shadow of a dangerous man named Thomas Morrison hunting them down. What his uncle Jeremiah left behind wasn't just property, it was a choice that would define Clayton's very soul. Will he fight for strangers who've become family, or will Morrison's ruthless pursuit destroy them all? Stay with me through this epic tale of love, justice, and redemption. Comment below with your city so I can see how far this story has traveled across the world. The mountain trail stretched endlessly before Clayton Reeves as his horse picked its way through the rocky terrain, each hoofbeat echoing against the towering pines that seemed to scrape the belly of the storm clouds above. October in the Colorado Territory was unforgiving, the kind of cold that bit through wool and leather alike, promising winter's arrival with every gust of wind that howled down from the peaks. Clayton pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and squinted ahead through the gathering dusk. 3 days of hard riding from Denver had brought him to this, the final stretch to Uncle Jeremiah's cabin, the inheritance that had changed everything. Just 6 weeks ago, he'd been breaking horses on a ranch outside Cheyenne, living paycheck to paycheck with nothing but the clothes on his back and dreams that seemed as distant as the stars. Then the lawyer's letter had arrived, bearing news that struck him like lightning from a clear sky. Jeremiah Reeves, his father's brother, the black sheep who'd vanished into the wilderness 20 years prior, was dead. And somehow, impossibly, he'd left everything to Clayton. The cabin, 40 acres of pristine mountain land, and according to the will, enough to start a man's life proper. Clayton had never expected anything from anyone, least of all from an uncle he'd met only once as a child. He remembered Jeremiah as a tall, weathered man with eyes like winter sky and hands that spoke of hard work and harder choices, the kind of man who seemed to carry the weight of untold stories in the lines around his eyes. Now, as the trail curved around a massive boulder formation, Clayton caught his first glimpse of smoke rising thin and gray against the darkening sky. His heart lurched. The cabin wasn't supposed to be occupied. According to the lawyer, Jeremiah had lived alone, a hermit who'd chosen solitude over society. "Easy, Thunder," Clayton murmured to his horse, a sturdy buckskin that had carried him faithfully from Wyoming. The animal's ears pricked forward, sensing his rider's tension. Something was wrong. Smoke meant people, and people meant complications Clayton wasn't prepared to handle. He guided Thunder up the final rise, and there it was, Uncle Jeremiah's cabin, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering evergreens. It was larger than Clayton had imagined, built from massive logs that spoke of craftsmanship and permanence. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and yellow light spilled from windows that should have been dark and empty. Clayton dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt 45 on his hip. Every instinct told him to approach with caution. Squatters were common in remote areas, and some were less than friendly to rightful owners showing up to reclaim property. He tied Thunder to a pine tree about 50 yards from the cabin and approached on foot, his boots crunching softly on fallen leaves. The smoke was definitely coming from the chimney, and he could see shadows moving behind the curtained windows. Voices drifted on the evening air, women's voices soft and melodic. Clayton's pulse quickened. This wasn't what he'd expected at all. He climbed the porch steps carefully, testing each board for creaks that might announce his presence. The voices inside became clearer now, and he caught fragments of conversation punctuated by gentle laughter. It sounded domestic, peaceful, like a family gathering around the dinner table. Clayton raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What if these people had been living here for months, maybe years? What if they had as much right to this place as he did? The lawyer had mentioned that Jeremiah's affairs were somewhat complicated but hadn't elaborated. Before he could second-guess himself further, the door swung open. Clayton found himself face to face with the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. She was tall and graceful, with auburn hair that caught the lamplight like burnished copper, and green eyes that seemed to look straight through to his soul. She wore a simple blue dress that somehow managed to be both modest and stunning, and there was something in her bearing, a quiet strength, a dignity that spoke of breeding and intelligence. "You must be Clayton," she said, her voice carrying the soft music of an educated Southern accent. "We've been expecting you." Clayton's mouth went dry. How did you—" "Please come in," she continued, stepping aside with a gesture that was both welcoming and somehow regal. "You must be exhausted from your journey. I'm Clarabelle Morrison." The name hit Clayton like a physical blow. Morrison. He'd heard that name before, though he couldn't place where, but there was no time to think as Clarabelle led him into the cabin's main room and Clayton's world shifted completely. 4 other women rose to greet him, each one stunning in her own unique way. A petite brunette with eyes like dark chocolate and a smile that could light up a room stepped forward first. "I'm Ruby," she said, offering her hand with a warmth that seemed genuine. "Ruby Chen, we're so glad you've finally arrived." Next came a tall, willowy blonde whose pale beauty had an almost ethereal quality. "Sadie Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Clayton couldn't identify. "Welcome to your home, Clayton." The third woman was smaller, with rich brown hair and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and humor. "Violet Banks," she said with a curtsy that was playful rather than formal. "And this is quite the reunion, isn't it?" Finally, a woman with striking black hair and features that spoke of mixed heritage stepped forward. "Grace Running Bear," she said simply, her dark eyes assessing Clayton with an intensity that made him feel like she was reading his character in real time. Clayton stood in the center of the room, hat in hand, feeling completely out of his depth. The cabin's interior was warm and inviting, furnished with handmade furniture that spoke of care and attention to detail. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the smell of fresh bread and something savory cooking filled the air. It felt like a home, a real home, not just a bachelor's wilderness retreat. "I don't understand," Clayton finally managed. "The lawyer said Uncle Jeremiah lived alone. He said the cabin would be empty." The women exchanged glances, and Clayton caught something in their expressions, a flicker of sadness, maybe fear. It was Clarabelle who spoke first. "Your uncle was a good man, Clayton, a very good man. He gave us sanctuary when we needed it most, and we've been caring for his home ever since." Sanctuary. Clayton's mind raced. From what? Another exchange of glances, this one heavier with meaning. Grace stepped forward, her voice steady but cautious. "Perhaps you should sit down," she said. "There's quite a lot to explain, and some of it isn't easy to hear." Clayton remained standing, every muscle in his body tense. "Just tell me straight. Are you squatters? Because if you are, I'm not looking to throw anyone out in the cold. But this is my property now, and—" "We're not squatters," Ruby interrupted, her voice carrying an edge of steel beneath its sweetness. "We have every right to be here." "What Ruby means," Clarabelle said diplomatically, "is that our situation is legally complex. Your uncle entered into certain arrangements before his death, arrangements that affect the ownership of this property." Clayton's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. "What kind of arrangements?" Violet disappeared into what looked like a bedroom and returned with a leather portfolio. She opened it carefully and withdrew a document that looked official and intimidating. "A contract," she said, handing it to Clayton. "Signed by your uncle 6 months before he died. It grants us residence rights to this cabin for as long as we choose to remain." Clayton took the document with hands that weren't quite steady. The legal language was dense and confusing, but certain phrases jumped out at him: permanent residence, transfer of custodial rights, protection agreement. At the bottom, in handwriting he recognized from family letters, was his uncle's signature. "I don't understand," Clayton said again, looking up from the contract. "Protection from what? Why would Uncle Jeremiah?" "Because he knew what kind of man my husband is," Clarabelle said quietly, and the pain in her voice was like a physical thing in the room. "Your husband?" Clayton's eyes went to her left hand, which bore no wedding ring. "Thomas Morrison," she said, and the other women visibly tensed at the name. "Though I pray to God he won't be my husband much longer." The name clicked into place then, and Clayton felt ice form from his stomach. Thomas Morrison, the territorial politician, the man who owned half the mining claims in Colorado and had his fingers in everything from cattle ranching to railroad development. Clayton had heard stories about Morrison, none of them good. They said he was ruthless in business and worse in his personal life. They said he had a temper that could turn deadly and connections that could make problems disappear. "Morrison," Clayton repeated slowly. "You're married to Thomas Morrison." "Not by choice," Clarabelle said, her chin lifting with defiance, "and not for much longer, if God is just." Sadie moved closer to Clarabelle, a gesture of support that spoke of deep friendship. "Thomas Morrison is a monster," she said, her soft voice carrying absolute conviction. "He destroyed Clarabelle's life, and he tried to destroy ours as well. We were all in his employment." Grace explained, her words careful and measured. "Under contracts that we thought were legitimate work agreements. We discovered too late that Thomas Morrison doesn't see women as people. He sees us as property." Ruby's hands clenched into fists. "He held false papers over our heads, claimed we owed him money we'd never borrowed, threatened our families if we tried to leave. We were trapped. Until Jeremiah helped us escape," Violet added softly. "He found out what Morrison was doing, and he couldn't stand by and watch it happen." Clayton sank into a chair, the weight of understanding settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. "So you're fugitives?" "We're survivors," Clarabelle corrected firmly, "and we have every intention of proving Morrison's crimes in a court of law. But that takes time and evidence, and until then, you need somewhere safe to hide." Clayton finished the thought, looking around at the 5 women who had transformed his inheritance into something far more complicated than simple property ownership. "We understand this puts you in a difficult position," Grace said. "We never intended to burden you with our troubles, but your uncle's will was very specific about our rights here." Clayton studied the contract again, his mind working through the implications. If this document was legitimate, and it certainly looked official, then these women had legal claim to residence in the cabin. But more than that, if they were telling the truth about Morrison, then Clayton was now standing between a powerful, dangerous man and 5 women he would do anything to reclaim. "How long has Morrison been looking for you?" he asked. 8 months, Ruby said, "ever since we disappeared from his ranch outside Colorado Springs. And he hasn't found you here. Your uncle was very clever about covering our tracks," Sadie explained. "And Morrison doesn't know about Jeremiah's connection to us. At least, we don't think he does." Clayton set the contract on the table and looked at each woman in turn. They were all watching him with a mixture of hope and fear, waiting for him to make a choice that would determine their fate. He could see the strength in them, but also the vulnerability. They'd been through hell, and they were asking him to help them survive a little longer. "What exactly did Uncle Jeremiah promise you?" he asked finally. Clarabelle reached into the portfolio and withdrew another document. "Safe passage to California," she said. "He was arranging transport and new identities for all of us. He died before he could complete the arrangements." "But the groundwork is laid," Grace added quickly. "We have contacts in San Francisco, people who can help us start new lives. We just need time to finalize everything." "How much time?" 2 months, Violet said. "Maybe 3 at the outside." Clayton stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness beyond. His horse was still tied to the tree, waiting patiently for a decision that would change everything. 3 days ago, his biggest worry had been whether he'd have enough money to make it through the winter. Now he was being asked to harbor fugitives from one of the most powerful men in the territory. "He'll come looking eventually," Clayton said, without turning around. "Morrison. If he's as determined as you say, he'll find this place." "Yes," Clarabelle said simply, "he will. And when he does, Grace said, her voice steady as stone. We'll be ready for him, Ma. Clayton turned back to face them. With what, 5 women against Morrison and however many men he brings with him, 5 women and 1 man, Ruby said pointedly, if you choose to stand with us. The weight of that choice settled over Clayton like a physical presence. He could honor his uncle's contract, help these women escape to California, and spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder for Morrison's revenge. Or he could turn them out, claim ignorance of their situation, and try to live with the knowledge that he'd abandoned 5 people who'd trusted his family to protect them. Tell me about Morrison, he said finally. Everything. If I'm going to make this choice, I need to know exactly what we're up against. Clarabelle closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, Clayton saw a depth of pain that made his chest tighten. Thomas Morrison, she began, is the kind of man who believes the world exists solely for his pleasure and profit. I married him when I was 17, fresh out of finishing school, and naive enough to believe his charm was real. For 5 years, I lived in a beautiful prison watching him destroy everything and everyone he touched. She moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames as she continued. He owns judges, sheriffs, territorial officials. He has business interests from Denver to Santa Fe, and he uses violence as casually as other men use words. The women he employs, we weren't the first and we won't be the last unless someone stops him. What kind of employment? Clayton asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. Officially, Sadie said bitterly, housekeepers, seamstresses, cooks. Unofficially, we were entertainment for his business associates, property to be displayed, used, and discarded when he grew bored. Ruby's voice was quiet but fierce. He told us we owed him money for food, lodging, clothing. Said we'd work off our debts, but the numbers never added up. Every month we owed more, not less. And if we questioned him... She pushed up her sleeve, revealing a thin white scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow. He made sure we understood the consequences of disobedience, she finished. Clayton felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. He'd known men like Morrison before, bullies who used power and fear to control those weaker than themselves. But this went beyond simple cruelty. This was systematic abuse, and it made his blood boil. How did Uncle Jeremiah get involved? He asked. Grace stepped forward. Jeremiah was delivering supplies to Morrison's ranch. He saw how we were treated, heard the fear in our voices. At first he just tried to be kind, brought us books, writing materials, small comforts, but then Morrison made a mistake, Violet continued. He hurt Clarabelle in front of Jeremiah, badly, and your uncle decided he'd seen enough. Jeremiah came to us 3 days later with a plan, Clarabelle said. He'd been watching Morrison's operation, gathering evidence of his illegal activities. Tax evasion claim, jumping, intimidation of territorial officials. But he needed our testimony to make the charges stick. So he helped you escape? Clayton said. More than that, Ruby said. He gave us hope. For the first time in years, we believed we might actually be free. Clayton walked back to the table and picked up the contract again. In the lamplight, his uncle's signature seemed to glow with purpose. Jeremiah had seen injustice and acted to stop it, regardless of the personal cost. It was the kind of moral courage Clayton had always admired but never been sure he possessed himself. Where's the evidence now? He asked. The proof of Morrison's crimes, hidden, Grace said simply. Jeremiah was very careful about that. He said if anything happened to him, we'd know where to find it. And do you? The women exchanged another look, this one heavy with meaning. Finally, Clarabelle nodded. Yes, she said. We do. Clayton set the contract down and looked around the room again. The fire was burning low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and reminding him that winter was coming fast. In a few weeks, the mountain passes would be snowed in, cutting them off from the outside world until spring. Morrison will make his move before the snow flies, he said, voicing his thoughts. If he's going to come for you, it'll be soon." "We know," Sadie said quietly. "We've been preparing." "Preparing how?" Instead of answering with words, Grace moved to a cabinet against the far wall and opened it carefully. Inside, Clayton could see rifles, pistols, and boxes of ammunition, all meticulously maintained and organized. "Jeremiah taught us to shoot," she explained. "All of us. He said if Morrison found us, we wouldn't go down without a fight." Clayton studied each woman's face, seeing determination where he'd expected fear. These weren't helpless victims waiting for rescue. They were fighters preparing for war. "You really think you can take on Morrison and his men?" "We think we have to try," Clarabelle said simply, "because the alternative is going back to the life we escaped, and that's not living at all." The conviction in her voice struck Clayton like a physical blow. Here were five women who'd risked everything for freedom, who'd found the courage to stand against a man who could crush them without consequence, and they were asking him to stand with them. Clayton thought about his life before this moment, the endless days of breaking horses for other men's ranches, the nights spent staring at stars and wondering if he'd ever amount to anything more than a drifter with a good seat and steady hands. He'd always imagined that when his moment came, when he had to choose between right and wrong, it would be clearer somehow, more obviously heroic. This felt messy, complicated, dangerous in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. But looking at these five women, at the strength in Clarabelle's bearing, the fire in Ruby's eyes, the quiet wisdom in Grace's expression, Clayton realized this was exactly the kind of choice that defined a man's character. "What would Uncle Jeremiah do?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to them. "Your uncle," Clarabelle said gently, "would ask what your heart tells you is right." Clayton closed his eyes and listened to the wind outside, to the crackling of the fire, to the soft breathing of five women who'd trusted him with their lives. When he opened his eyes again, his decision was clear. "Then I guess we need to talk about how to keep you all alive until spring," he said. The relief that washed over their faces was like sunrise after the darkest night. Ruby actually laughed, a sound of pure joy that filled the cabin with warmth. "You mean it?" Violet asked. "You'll really help us." "I mean it," Clayton said firmly. "Morrison wants a fight, he'll get one, but he's not taking any of you back to that life. Not while I'm breathing." Clarabelle stepped forward and placed her hand on his arm. The touch sent electricity through Clayton's entire body, but it was her eyes that truly undid him, green as spring grass and bright with unshed tears of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "You can't know what this means to us." "I'm beginning to understand," Clayton replied, and he realized it was true. This cabin, these women, this choice, it all felt like destiny, like everything in his life had been leading to this moment. Grace moved to the stove and began ladling stew into bowls. "You must be starving," she said practically. "We can plan our defense better on full stomachs." As the women busied themselves setting the table, Clayton found himself truly looking at the cabin for the first time. It wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. The windows were positioned to provide clear fields of fire in all directions. The walls were thick enough to stop bullets, and he could see evidence of reinforcement work that his uncle must have done specifically for this situation. "Jeremiah really thought of everything, didn't he?" Clayton mused. "Your uncle was a remarkable man," Sadie said, setting a bowl of stew in front of him. "He saved our lives, and now I'll do everything I can to keep you safe," Clayton finished. "All of you." As they sat down to eat together, Clayton felt something he'd never experienced before, the sense of belonging to something larger than himself. These women weren't just fugitives anymore. They were his responsibility, his family, his purpose. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, carrying the promise of winter and the threat of Thomas Morrison's eventual arrival. But inside the cabin, surrounded by the warmth of new friendships and the strength of shared purpose, Clayton Reeves finally understood what his uncle had really left him. Not just property, but a chance to become the man he was meant to be. As Clarabelle smiled at him across the table, Clayton realized his inheritance was worth more than he'd ever imagined, and he'd fight to the death to protect it. The storm was coming, but they'd be ready. The next morning brought a crystalline clarity to the mountain air that made every detail sharp as broken glass. Clayton woke before dawn, his body still adjusting to the thin altitude and the weight of decisions that had changed everything. Through the window of the small room the women had prepared for him, he could see frost painting the pine needles silver in the early light. The cabin was already stirring with quiet activity. He could hear soft voices in the kitchen, the gentle clatter of breakfast preparations, the kind of domestic sounds that spoke of women who'd learned to find normalcy even in the midst of danger. It struck him how quickly they'd made this place feel like home, despite the circumstances that had brought them here. Clayton dressed quickly and stepped into the main room to find Grace standing at the window, a cup of coffee steaming in her hands. She turned at his approach, her dark eyes assessing him with the same intensity he'd noticed the night before. "Sleep well?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Not particularly," Clayton admitted. "Too much to think about." Grace nodded, unsurprised. "The first night is always the hardest, when reality sets in and you understand what you've committed to." "Any regrets?" Clayton asked, studying her face. "About choosing to stand against Morrison?" Grace's expression hardened. "Never. About dragging you into our fight every day." Before Clayton could respond, Clarabelle emerged from the kitchen carrying a plate of eggs and bacon that made his stomach remind him he'd barely touched dinner the night before. She'd pinned her auburn hair back in a practical style that somehow made her even more beautiful, and the morning light streaming through the windows turned her green eyes to emerald. "You need to eat," she said, setting the plate on the table with the kind of gentle authority that brooked no argument. "We have a lot of work to do today." "What kind of work?" Clayton asked, settling into his chair. Ruby appeared from what he was beginning to realize was a remarkably well-organized household, carrying a leather satchel that looked both official and ominous. "The kind that might keep us alive when Morrison comes calling," she said, her usual cheerfulness tempered by grim determination. Violet and Sadie joined them at the table, and Clayton noticed how they moved together with the easy coordination of people who'd learned to depend on each other completely. There was something almost military in their efficiency, as if Uncle Jeremiah had trained them for this moment. "Tell me about the evidence," Clayton said, between bites of what might have been the best breakfast he'd ever tasted. "What exactly did Uncle Jeremiah collect on Morrison?" Clarabelle exchanged a look with the others before opening the satchel. "Financial records, mostly. Proof that Morrison has been falsifying mining claims, bribing territorial officials, and using violence to intimidate competitors." She withdrew a thick folder of documents, some in Jeremiah's careful handwriting, others that looked like official territorial paperwork. "Your uncle was extraordinarily thorough. He documented everything, dates, times, witnesses, amounts of money that changed hands." "This is just a copy," Grace added. "Jeremiah hid the original somewhere even we don't know about. He said it was safer that way." Clayton studied the papers, his anger growing with each page. Morrison's crimes weren't just against these 5 women, they were against the entire territory. The man had systematically corrupted officials, stolen land that belonged to honest settlers, and used fear as his primary business tool. "Why hasn't anyone stopped him before now?" Clayton asked. "Because he's careful about who he hurts," Sadie said quietly. "And because the people with the power to stop him are usually the ones he's paying." Ruby's hands clenched into fists on the table. "Plus, who's going to believe the word of women like us against a man of Morrison's standing? We were his employees, his property. Our testimony alone wouldn't be enough." "But combined with this evidence," Violet gestured to the documents spread across the table. "Combined with this evidence, we might actually have a chance," Clarabelle finished, "if we can get it to the right people." Clayton leaned back in his chair, his mind working through the implications. Who are the right people? Morrison's bought half the territorial government. Not all of it, Grace said firmly. There's a federal marshal named Camille Hartford who's been investigating corruption in Colorado territory. He's based out of Denver, and according to our sources, he's completely clean. Our sources? Clayton raised an eyebrow. Your uncle wasn't working alone, Ruby explained. There's a network of people who've been quietly documenting Morrison's crimes for months. Shopkeepers who've been extorted, ranchers who've had their land stolen, officials who refuse to be bought. Clarabelle stood and moved to another cabinet, withdrawing a detailed map of the territory marked with pins and annotations. Jeremiah was coordinating all of it, building a case that would be impossible for Morrison to escape or corrupt his way out of. Clayton studied the map, seeing the scope of Morrison's influence marked in red ink. It stretched from Colorado Springs to the New Mexico border, encompassing mining claims, ranches, and entire towns. This is bigger than I thought, he said quietly. Much bigger, Sadie agreed. Which is why Morrison can't afford to let us live. We know too much, and we have the documentation to prove it. So what's the plan? Clayton asked. How do we get this evidence to Marshal Hartford? The women exchanged another of their meaningful looks, and Clayton was beginning to recognize this as their way of communicating without words. Finally, Grace spoke. That's where things get complicated, she said. We can't leave the cabin. Morrison has people watching the main trails, and we can't trust anyone else to carry the evidence to Denver. Plus, Violet added, we don't know how much time we have. Morrison's been getting more aggressive in his search, more desperate. Clayton felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What do you mean, more desperate? Clarabelle returned to the table, her expression grave. 3 weeks ago, he raided a farm outside Pueblo looking for us. When the family who owned it couldn't tell him anything, he burned their barn and threatened their children. Last week, Ruby continued, he offered a $1,000 reward for information leading to our capture, in a territory where most people don't see that much money in a year. He's running out of patience, Grace concluded, which means he's going to make mistakes. But it also means he's going to be more dangerous than ever. Clayton pushed back from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful mountain vista that concealed so much danger. How long do you think we have before he finds us? Sadie considered the question carefully. Jeremiah always said this place would be discovered eventually. Too many people knew he lived up here, even if they didn't know about us. A month, Clarabelle said quietly. Maybe less if he gets lucky, or if someone talks. Then we need to go on the offensive, Clayton said, turning back to face them. Waiting here for him to come to us puts us at a disadvantage. What are you suggesting? Violet asked. Clayton's mind was racing, pieces of a plan beginning to form. We get the evidence to Marshal Hartford ourselves, but we do it in a way that forces Morrison's hand. Ruby leaned forward, interested. How? We make him think he's found us, Clayton said slowly. Set a trap that draws him out into the open where his usual advantages don't help him. Grace shook her head immediately. Too dangerous if something goes wrong. If something goes wrong with our current plan, we're dead anyway, Clayton interrupted. At least this way we're taking action instead of just waiting. Clarabelle studied his face intently. What kind of trap are you thinking about? Clayton moved to the map, his finger tracing the mountain trails that surrounded the cabin. Morrison doesn't know this territory like we do. Uncle Jeremiah chose this location for a reason. It's defensible, but more importantly, there's only one good way in or out. The main trail, Sadie said, understanding beginning to dawn in her voice. Exactly. If we can get word to Morrison that we're here, control when and how he approaches, we can choose the time and place for our confrontation. Violet looked skeptical. That sounds like suicide with extra steps. Not if we do it right, Clayton said, his confidence growing as the plan solidified in his mind. Think about it, Morrison's used to fighting in towns and cities where he can use his money and connections. Out here, it's just skill and courage. And superior numbers, Ruby pointed out. He'll bring an army. Which works to our advantage, Clayton said. Large groups are slower, noisier, easier to track. And this terrain, he gestured toward the window, it's perfect for guerrilla tactics. Grace stood and joined him at the map. You're talking about turning ourselves into bait. I'm talking about turning the tables on a man who's used to being the hunter, Clayton corrected, making him come to us on our terms where we have every advantage except numbers. Clarabelle was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes studying the map with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of command. It could work, she said slowly, but it would require perfect timing and absolute trust. Do we have any other choice? Clayton asked. The question hung in the air like smoke heavy with implication. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and reminding them all that winter was approaching fast. Soon the mountain passes would be impassable, trapping them here until spring or until Morrison found them. If we're going to do this, Sadie said finally, we need to be smart about it, plan every detail. And we need to move fast, Violet added, before Morrison finds us on his own. Ruby stood and began pacing her mind, clearly working through possibilities. We'd need someone to carry word to Morrison, someone he'd believe. And someone else to get the evidence to Denver, Grace said. Even if our trap works perfectly, we need to ensure the marshal gets what he needs to prosecute. Clayton felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before any dangerous undertaking, but this time it was tempered by something he'd never experienced before, the absolute certainty that he was fighting for something worth dying for. Then let's start planning, he said. The next several hours passed in intensive preparation. The women moved with military precision, each one taking responsibility for different aspects of their defense. Clarabelle coordinated overall strategy with the kind of natural leadership that suggested she'd been born for command rather than submission. Ruby took charge of weapons and ammunition, her small hands steady and sure as she cleaned rifles and counted cartridges. Sadie focused on supplies and logistics, calculating how much food and water they'd need for an extended siege. Violet worked on escape routes and contingency plans, mapping out every possible way off the mountain if their primary strategy failed. Grace handled intelligence gathering, organizing the network of contacts that Jeremiah had built throughout the territory. Clayton found himself constantly amazed by their competence and courage. These weren't helpless victims waiting for rescue. They were fighters who'd been preparing for this battle since the day they'd escaped Morrison's ranch. Your uncle trained you well, he said to Clarabelle, as they worked together to reinforce the cabin's defenses. Jeremiah understood something that most men don't, she replied, hammering a board into place over one of the windows. He knew that teaching us to shoot wasn't enough. He had to teach us to think like warriors. Is that what you are now? Warriors? Clarabelle paused in her work and looked at him directly. We're whatever we need to be to survive, she said simply, and to make sure Morrison never hurts anyone else the way he hurt us. As afternoon faded toward evening, they gathered around the table to finalize their plan. The evidence was carefully divided. Copies would remain hidden at the cabin, while the originals made their way to Denver through a network of trusted contacts. Clayton would ride to Colorado Springs to deliver a message that would draw Morrison to the mountains, while the women prepared the cabin for siege. The timing has to be perfect, Grace emphasized for the third time. Morrison needs to believe he's catching us by surprise, but we need to be ready for him too. 3 days, Clayton said. I'll need that long to get to Colorado Springs and back. That gives you time to complete the preparations here, and gives our contact time to get the evidence to Marshal Hartford, Ruby added. Violet looked up from the map she'd been studying. What if Morrison doesn't take the bait? What if he's suspicious? He won't be, Clarabelle said with absolute certainty. Thomas Morrison's greatest weakness is his arrogance. He's convinced that we're helpless women cowering in fear of him, of The idea that we might set a trap will never occur to him. And if something goes wrong? Sadie asked quietly. The question they'd all been avoiding hung in the air like a storm cloud. Clayton looked around the table at 5 faces that had become precious to him in less than 24 hours, and he felt something twist in his chest at the thought of losing any of them. Nothing's going to go wrong, he said firmly, because we're not going to let it. That night, as the others prepared for sleep, Clayton found himself alone with Clarabelle on the cabin's front porch. The stars were brilliant in the thin mountain air, and the silence was so complete it seemed to have weight. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly. Clayton considered the question honestly. "Terrified," he admitted, "but not of Morrison." "What then? Of failing you, all of you." He turned to look at her, this remarkable woman who'd endured hell and emerged stronger. "Yesterday I was nobody special, just another drifter with no family and no future. Now I have something worth fighting for, and I'm scared I'm not strong enough to protect it." Clarabelle moved closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used and see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "Strength isn't about being fearless, Clayton. It's about doing what's right even when you're afraid. Is that what you did when you decided to leave Morrison?" "That's what we all did." Her voice carried the weight of remembered pain. "Every day we stayed with him, we died a little more inside. Leaving wasn't brave, it was survival. And now we have a chance to live, really live, not just exist." She placed her hand on his arm, and the touch sent electricity through his entire body. "Thanks to you." Clayton covered her hand with his, marveling at how perfectly it fit. "Thanks to Uncle Jeremiah, and your own courage." "Jeremiah gave us hope," Clarabelle said softly. "But you gave us something more. You gave us a future." The weight of those words settled over Clayton like a mantle of responsibility and purpose. Looking into Clarabelle's eyes, he understood that his life had been divided into 2 parts before this moment and after. Everything that came next would be measured against this choice, this commitment, this woman whose strength humbled him and whose trust he would die before betraying. Morrison's going to regret the day he crossed paths with Jeremiah Reeves's family, Clayton said quietly. Clarabelle smiled, then the first truly peaceful expression he'd seen on her face. "Yes," she said, "he is." Inside the cabin, the others were preparing for sleep, but Clayton knew rest would be elusive tonight. Tomorrow he would ride into danger carrying a message that would set their desperate plan in motion. In 3 days, Thomas Morrison would come for them with fire and steel, expecting to find helpless prey. Instead, he would find predators ready for war. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of approaching winter and the promise of violence. But for the first time since inheriting his uncle's legacy, Clayton felt truly at peace with his choice. He had found his purpose in protecting 5 extraordinary women who deserved far better than the world had given them. Tomorrow the hunt would begin in earnest. Tonight, surrounded by the strength and warmth of his chosen family, Clayton Reeves prepared to become the man his uncle had always believed he could be. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, witnesses to human courage and human folly in equal measure. In the cabin below, 5 women and 1 man made their final preparations for a battle that would determine not just their survival, but their very souls. Dawn was coming, and with it the chance to right justice with blood and courage on the unforgiving canvas of the Colorado mountains. Clayton rode out before sunrise, the mountain air sharp as a blade against his face, as thunder picked his way down the treacherous trail in the pre-dawn darkness. Behind him, the cabin grew smaller until it disappeared entirely among the towering pines, but he could still feel the weight of 5 pairs of eyes watching him go, trusting him to set their desperate gambit in motion. The ride to Colorado Springs would take him through some of the most dangerous territory in the Rockies, not just because of the terrain, but because Morrison's men were everywhere. their eyes and ears tuned for any whisper of the fugitive women. Clayton had memorized the faces from wanted posters Grace had shown him, rough men with cold eyes who killed for money and asked no questions about justice or mercy. As the sun crested the eastern peaks, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Clayton allowed himself one last look back toward the hidden valley where his new family waited. The plan they'd crafted was audacious. In its simplicity, Clayton would deliver a carefully worded message to one of Morrison's known associates in Colorado Springs, a saloon keeper named Dutch Carver, who served as the man's unofficial intelligence network. The message would suggest that a mountain trader had spotted 5 women matching Morrison's description near an abandoned mining camp 30 miles north of the cabin, far enough to give them time to prepare, close enough to seem credible. The deception had to be perfect. Too obvious, and Morrison would smell a trap. Too subtle, and he might not take the bait at all. Everything depended on Clayton's ability to play the part of a simple cowboy looking to earn some easy money by selling information. Thunder's hooves rang against stone as they descended a particularly treacherous section of trail, and Clayton found his thoughts turning to the woman who'd occupied his mind since the moment she'd opened that cabin door. Clarabelle Morrison, though she'd insisted he call her Clarabelle Whitmore, now reclaiming her maiden name along with her freedom. There was something about her that went beyond mere beauty, a strength of character that had survived 5 years of hell and emerged not broken but tempered like fine steel. The way she'd looked at him as he'd prepared to leave, with trust, yes, but also with something deeper that made his chest tight with emotions he'd never experienced before. Clayton had known his share of women over the years, but none had ever made him feel like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, simultaneously terrified and exhilarated by the prospect of falling. By midday, he'd reached the main road that led to Colorado Springs, and the mountains gave way to rolling hills, dotted with ranches and small settlements. This was Morrison's heartland, where his influence was strongest and his reach longest. Clayton forced himself to relax in the saddle, adopting the easy posture of a man with nothing to hide and nowhere urgent to be. The first test came at a trading post, where the road forked toward town. 2 men lounged on the porch, their clothes dusty from hard riding and their hands never straying far from their guns. Clayton recognized them from Grace's descriptions, Willis and Santos, 2 of Morrison's most trusted enforcers. "Afternoon," Clayton called out in the lazy drawl he'd perfected over years of ranch work. He dismounted slowly, making no sudden movements that might alarm the watchers. "Afternoon," Willis replied, his pale eyes cataloging every detail of Clayton's appearance. "Haven't seen you around these parts before." "Just passing through," Clayton said, leading Thunder to the water trough. "Heading down to the springs to see about some work." "What kind of work?" Santos asked, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. Clayton shrugged, the picture of a man with few options and fewer prospects. "Whatever pays. Been working a ranch up near Cheyenne, but the owner sold out. Figured I'd try my luck down here." The 2 men exchanged a look that Clayton pretended not to notice. Morrison's network was always recruiting, always looking for men willing to do dirty work for good pay. It was exactly the kind of opportunity they'd be watching for. "Might be we could point you toward some opportunities," Willis said carefully, "depending on what kind of man you are." "The kind that minds his own business and does what he's paid to do," Clayton replied, which was the correct answer in Morrison's world. Santos nodded approvingly. "Stop by the Lucky Dollar Saloon when you get to town. Ask for Dutch Carver. Tell him Willis sent you." "Much obliged," Clayton said, touching the brim of his hat. He remounted Thunder and continued toward town, feeling their eyes on his back until he was out of sight around a bend in the road. The encounter had gone perfectly, almost too perfectly. Clayton reminded himself that Morrison's organization was built on paranoia and violence, but it was also remarkably efficient at what it did. By the time he reached Colorado Springs, word would already have spread that a new face was in town, someone potentially useful to their operations. Colorado Springs bustled with the kind of rough energy that characterized boomtowns throughout the territory. Miners, ranchers, merchants, and drifters mingled on wooden sidewalks slick with mud and worse things. The smell of horses, unwashed bodies, and whiskey hung in the air like a permanent cloud, and the sound of hammers and saws suggested the town was still growing fast enough to outpace itself. Clayton found a stable for Thunder and walked the main street, taking careful note of the layout and the faces. Morrison's influence was everywhere in the expensive suits of men who clearly didn't work with their hands, in the deference shown by shopkeepers and officials, in the nervous way people avoided certain buildings and certain conversations. The Lucky Dollar Saloon squatted in the middle of the main street, like a spider in its web, 3 stories of rough-hewn timber and glass that had seen better days. Piano music drifted from the bat-wing doors, punctuated by laughter and the occasional curse. Clayton pushed through into a haze of tobacco smoke and masculine sweat, his eyes adjusting slowly to the dim interior. Dutch Carver was exactly what Clayton had expected, a big man gone soft around the middle with thinning hair and clever eyes that missed nothing. He held court at a corner table where he could see both the front and back doors, flanked by men whose hands stayed close to their weapons, even while drinking. "You must be the fellow Willis mentioned," Carver said, as Clayton approached. His voice carried the trace of an accent that might have been Dutch or German. "Looking for work, I hear." "That's right," Clayton said, settling into the chair Carver indicated. "Willis said you might know of some opportunities." "Depends on the kind of opportunity you're looking for." Carver signaled the bartender for another round. "This territory's got work for men with various talents." Clayton accepted the whiskey and took a sip, letting the burn settle in his stomach before responding. "I'm not particular long as it pays fair wages for fair work." "Fair's a relative term," one of Carver's companions said with a laugh that held no humor. "What Jake means," Carver said smoothly, "is that some work pays better than others, especially work that requires discretion." "I can be discreet," Clayton said. "Good to hear." Carver leaned back in his chair, studying Clayton with the intensity of a man trying to peer into his soul. "Tell me, friend, and I didn't catch your name." "Clayton Reeves." "Mr. Reeves, in your travels, have you perhaps noticed anything unusual? People where they shouldn't be, perhaps strangers keeping to themselves?" This was it, the moment Clayton had been preparing for since leaving the cabin. Everything depended on his ability to sell the lie with just the right mixture of greed and reluctance. "Funny you should ask," Clayton said slowly, as if considering whether to reveal valuable information. "Saw something a few days back that struck me as odd." Carver's eyes sharpened immediately. "Oh." "Was delivering supplies to a mining operation up near Copper Creek." Clayton continued, naming a location 30 miles from the cabin. "Abandoned place, mostly, but I saw smoke, and when I got closer—" He paused, taking another sip of whiskey, as if gathering courage. "Well?" Jake prompted impatiently. "Saw 5 women," Clayton said. "Pretty ones, too, dressed too fine for mining country, if you catch my meaning, keeping to themselves, jumping at shadows like they were running from something." The effect was immediate and electric. Carver straightened in his chair and his companions exchanged looks, loaded with significance. Clayton could practically see the dollar signs calculating in their eyes. 5 women, you say?" Carver's voice was carefully neutral, but Clayton caught the undercurrent of excitement. "That's right. Auburn-haired one seemed to be in charge. Pretty as a picture, but with steel in her spine." "And where exactly did you see these women?" Clayton hesitated, playing the part of a man realizing he might have stumbled onto something valuable. "Now hold on. If this information's worth something to you, I think we should discuss terms." Carver smiled, and it was like watching a wolf bare its teeth. "A businessman, I like that. What did you have in mind? Depends on how much it's worth to you." "Could be worth quite a lot," Carver said carefully. "To the right person. Someone who's been looking for those particular women for a long time." "How much is quite a lot?" $500. The sum was staggering, more money than most men saw in 2 years of honest work. Clayton let his eyes widen appropriately while his mind raced. Morrison was desperate to find them, desperate enough to pay a fortune for reliable information. 500, Clayton repeated. Must be some important women. Important to my employer, Carver said. Do we have a deal, Mr. Reeves? Clayton pretended to consider, though his heart was pounding with the knowledge that he was about to set events in motion that could end with all of them dead. Half now, half when your employer confirms the information is good. Fair enough. Carver reached into his vest and withdrew a thick roll of bills. He counted out $250 more cash than Clayton had ever held in his life and slid it across the table. The women are camped in the old Dutchman's mine about 30 miles northeast of here, Clayton said, pocketing the money. Saw them yesterday morning. Looked like they were planning to stay a while. Excellent. Carver's smile grew wider. My employer will be very pleased indeed. When do I get the rest? Soon, Carver promised. Very soon. Where can we reach you? I'll be at Morrison's Hotel, Clayton said, naming the establishment he'd spotted on his way through town. Room 12. Perfect. Enjoy your evening, Mr. Reeves. You've earned it. Clayton finished his drink and left the saloon, every nerve ending screaming with the need to run, to get as far from Colorado Springs as possible before Morrison's men discovered the deception. But running now would only confirm their suspicions. Instead, he forced himself to walk calmly to the hotel register for a room and settle in to wait. The hours crawled by like wounded animals. Clayton lay on the narrow bed, fully clothed and ready to move at a moment's notice while his imagination conjured increasingly horrific scenarios. What if Morrison was already at the cabin? What if the women had been discovered before he could spring their trap? What if he'd miscalculated everything and led them all to slaughter? Near midnight, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside his room. Heavy boots that belonged to men who weren't trying to hide their presence. Clayton's hand moved to his gun as the steps stopped outside his door, a soft knock. Mr. Reeves, Mr. Carver would like a word. Clayton opened the door to find two men he didn't recognize, both armed and both wearing the kind of expressions that suggested disobedience would be unhealthy. Now, Clayton asked. Now, one of them confirmed. They escorted him through empty streets to a warehouse on the outskirts of town, where Dutch Carver waited in a circle of lamplight. But he wasn't alone. A tall, distinguished man in an expensive suit stood beside him, and Clayton felt ice form in his veins as he recognized Thomas Morrison from Grace's detailed descriptions. Morrison was exactly what Clayton had expected, and somehow worse, handsome, in the way that predators often were, with silver hair and pale eyes that seemed to look right through a man's flesh to the weakness beneath. He radiated the kind of casual authority that came from years of having every word treated as law and every whim instantly gratified. Mr. Reeves, Morrison said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of Eastern education, I understand you have information about some missing property of mine. Property. The word hit Clayton like a physical blow, confirming everything the women had told him about Morrison's view of them. But he forced his expression to remain neutral, playing the part of a simple cowboy who'd stumbled into something he didn't fully understand. Yes, sir. 5 women, like I told Mr. Carver. Describe them, Morrison commanded. Clayton repeated the descriptions he'd memorized, watching Morrison's face for any sign of suspicion. Instead, he saw something far worse, possessive satisfaction, like a man contemplating the recovery of valuable livestock. You're certain of the location? Yes, sir. Old Dutchman's mine, 30 miles northeast. Saw them clear as day. Morrison nodded slowly. Mr. Carver, prepare 20 men. We ride at first light. 20 men. Clayton's blood turned to ice water. The plan had called for Morrison to bring a large force, but 20 armed killers was more than they'd anticipated. He forced himself to remain calm, to show nothing of the terror clawing at his insides. "About the rest of my payment," Clayton said. Morrison smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Clayton had ever seen. "Of course, you've been most helpful, Mr. Reeves. Most helpful indeed." He nodded to Carver, who counted out the remaining $250. But as Clayton reached for the money, Morrison's hand closed over his wrist with surprising strength. "Tell me, Mr. Reeves," Morrison said conversationally, "what brought you to this particular part of the territory? It's somewhat off the beaten path for a man seeking ranch work." Clayton's mouth went dry, but he forced himself to meet Morrison's pale gaze steadily. "Like I told Mr. Carver, I was delivering supplies to a mining operation. Just happened to be in the right place at the right time." "Indeed." Morrison's grip tightened. "And this mining operation who hired you?" The question was a trap, and Clayton knew it. Morrison was testing him, looking for inconsistencies in his story. The wrong answer would mean death, not just for him, but for the 5 women waiting in the cabin. "Fellow named Henderson," Clayton said, choosing a common name. "One-time job, cash payment. Didn't ask too many questions." Morrison held his gaze for what felt like eternity before releasing his wrist. "Wise policy. Questions can be dangerous in this territory." "Yes, sir." "You'll ride with us tomorrow," Morrison said suddenly, "to ensure the accuracy of your information." Clayton's heart hammered against his ribs, but he nodded calmly. "Of course, sir." "Excellent. We leave at dawn. Don't disappoint me, Mr. Reeves. I find disappointment unpleasant." The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone Morrison might use to comment on the weather, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. Clayton pocketed the money and left the warehouse, every step taking tremendous effort, as the magnitude of what he'd set in motion crashed over him like an avalanche. 20 men at dawn, and he had to ride with them, maintaining his deception all the way to the trap they'd prepared. If he made even the smallest mistake, if Morrison suspected for even a moment that he was being led into an ambush, they would all die in ways that didn't bear thinking about. Back at the hotel, Clayton didn't even pretend to sleep. Instead, he sat by the window watching the stars wheel overhead and thinking about Clarabelle's green eyes, about Ruby's fierce determination, about Grace's quiet strength. They were counting on him to deliver Morrison into their hands, and he could not fail them. Dawn came gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering over the mountains like an omen. Clayton met Morrison's party at the livery stable, where 20 hard-faced men sat their horses with the easy confidence of professional killers. Their leader was a scarred giant named Kruger, who looked like he'd stepped out of a nightmare, and their weapons were clean and well-maintained. "Mr. Reeves," Morrison said as Clayton mounted Thunder, "I trust you slept well." "Well enough," Clayton replied. "Good. Today should prove most illuminating." They rode out of Colorado Springs like a small army, dust rising from their horses' hooves and sunlight glinting off gun barrels and spurs. Clayton positioned himself near the middle of the group, close enough to Morrison to maintain the pretense of guiding them, but far enough from the flankers to avoid casual conversation. The miles passed slowly, each one bringing them closer to the moment of truth. Clayton found himself studying the men around him, memorizing faces and noting weapons, filing away information that might prove crucial in the hours to come. They were hard men, killers, every one, but they were also overconfident. They expected to find 5 helpless women cowering in an abandoned mine, not a carefully prepared ambush. That overconfidence might be the only advantage Clayton and the women had. As they climbed into the foothills, Morrison rode up beside Clayton. "Tell me about these women," he said casually. "Did they seem, well?" The question was loaded with meaning, and Clayton chose his words carefully. "Seemed healthy enough, nervous, like I said, jumpy." "As they should be," Morrison said with satisfaction. "They've caused me considerable inconvenience." "Must be important to you to bring this many men." Morrison's pale eyes fixed on Clayton with laser intensity. "They're my property, Mr. Reeves." and I protect what's mine." There it was again, property. Clayton bit back the response that rose to his lips and simply nodded. "Yes, sir." They were entering the trap zone now, the carefully chosen terrain where the women would make their stand. Clayton's pulse quickened as he recognized landmarks from the map they'd studied together. Somewhere ahead, hopefully well hidden, 5 remarkable women were preparing to face down an army for their freedom. "How much farther?" Morrison asked. "Not far now," Clayton replied truthfully. "Just over that ridge." Morrison raised his hand, and the column halted. "Kruger," he called, "take 10 men and circle around behind the mine. I want every exit covered." "Yes, sir," the scarred giant replied, signaling half the force to follow him. As the group split up, Clayton felt the trap closing, not just around Morrison, but around all of them. In minutes, shooting would start, and people would die. He thought of Clarabelle one more time, holding on to the memory of her strength like a talisman against the violence to come. The final act was about to begin, and God help them all, there would be no turning back now. Morrison spurred his horse forward as they crested the ridge, and Clayton's heart hammered against his ribs as the abandoned Dutchman's mine came into view below. The weathered buildings and rusted equipment scattered across the hillside looked exactly as desolate as they'd hoped, the perfect place for desperate women to hide, and the perfect place for an ambush. "There," Clayton said, pointing toward the largest structure. "Saw smoke coming from that building yesterday." Morrison raised a spyglass to his eye, scanning the mine buildings with predatory intensity. "I don't see any smoke now." "Could be they're keeping the fire low," Clayton suggested, his mouth dry as sawdust, trying not to attract attention. Morrison lowered the spyglass and turned to the remaining men. "Spread out. I want this entire area surrounded before we move in. No one escapes." Clayton watched the killers deploy with military precision, his mind racing through calculations of distance and timing. The real cabin was still 15 miles away, hidden in a valley that Morrison's men would never find without specific directions. But somewhere in these rocks and abandoned buildings, the women had prepared a reception that would turn the hunter into the hunted. At least that was the plan. Looking at Morrison's cold efficiency and the professional way his men moved to surround the mine, Clayton felt doubt gnawing at his confidence like acid. 20 armed killers against 5 women, and whatever surprise they'd managed to prepare, the odds were staggering. "Mr. Reeves," Morrison said, his pale eyes glittering with anticipation, "you'll accompany me. I want you to point out exactly where you saw my property." Property. The word made Clayton's jaw clench, but he nodded obediently. "Yes, sir." They descended toward the mine in single file, Morrison's horse picking its way carefully down the rocky slope. Clayton could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching them, and he prayed that whoever was hidden in those rocks had the patience to wait for the perfect moment. As they reached the bottom of the slope, Morrison held up his hand for silence. The morning air was crisp and still, carrying the scent of pine and the metallic tang of old mining equipment. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out, but otherwise the world seemed to hold its breath. "Jenkins," Morrison called softly to one of his men, "take 3 men and check the outlying buildings. Carson, you take the mine entrance. I want every structure searched." The men moved with practiced efficiency, weapons drawn and eyes alert. Clayton found himself admiring their skill, even as he hoped desperately that it wouldn't be enough. These weren't the usual collection of thugs and drifters that most territorial bosses employed. These were professional soldiers, men who'd learned their trade in wars that had taught them how to kill quickly and without mercy. Morrison dismounted near the largest building, a structure that had once housed mining equipment, but now stood empty and scarred by weather and time. Clayton followed suit, his hand resting casually on his gun butt, while his eyes searched the surrounding rocks for any sign of movement. "You're certain this is where you saw them?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying a note of suspicion that made Clayton's blood turn to ice water. "Yes, sir. Right here." The auburn-haired woman was standing in that doorway, and the others were moving around inside. Morrison studied the building with the intensity of a man who'd learned to trust his instincts over everything else. "The dust doesn't look disturbed," he said finally. "No sign of recent habitation." Clayton's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "Was 2 days ago, sir. Wind could have covered any tracks." "Perhaps?" Morrison's pale eyes fixed on Clayton with laser intensity. "Or perhaps you're not being entirely truthful with me, Mr. Reeves." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a powder charge, and Clayton felt every muscle in his body tense for action. This was it, the moment where everything could fall apart in blood and gunfire. Morrison's men were spread out around the mine, but they were still within easy range of their boss's voice. One shout would bring them running. "I don't understand, sir," Clayton said, playing for time while his mind raced through options. "I told you what I saw." "Indeed you did." Morrison's hand moved to his gun, a casual gesture that somehow managed to be more threatening than an outright draw. "The question is whether what you saw was really my missing property, or whether you saw something else entirely." Clayton met Morrison's gaze steadily, knowing that any sign of weakness or fear would be his death sentence. "I know what I saw. Do you?" Morrison smiled, and it was like watching a snake coil to strike. "Because I'm beginning to think you know a great deal more than you're telling me." The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the tension like a gunshot. Both men turned to see Kruger riding hard from the direction of the mine entrance, his scarred face grim with news that clearly wasn't good. "Sir," Kruger called as he reined in his horse, "we've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The mine's been sealed. Recent work, too. Someone's been here, but they're long gone." Morrison's expression darkened like a storm cloud, and when he turned back to Clayton, his pale eyes held the promise of violence. "It seems, Mr. Reeves, that your information was somewhat incomplete." Clayton's hand inched toward his gun, but Morrison was faster. The older man's pistol cleared leather with practiced ease, the barrel coming to rest pointed directly at Clayton's chest. "Now then," Morrison said conversationally, "suppose you tell me what's really going on here." The crack of a rifle split the morning air like thunder, and Kruger pitched backward off his horse with a scream that was cut short by the wet sound of impact. Blood bloomed across his chest like a crimson flower, and his body hit the ground with the finality of death. Morrison spun toward the sound, his gun tracking across the rocks where powder smoke was already dissipating. "Ambush!" he roared. "Take cover!" The mine erupted into chaos as more rifle shots rang out from concealed positions among the rocks and abandoned buildings. Clayton dove behind a rusted ore cart as bullets whined overhead, Morrison's men scattering for whatever shelter they could find. The professional composure that had marked their approach dissolved into confusion, as an enemy they couldn't see picked them off with methodical precision. "Jenkins is down," someone shouted from the direction of the outbuildings. "Carson, too," came another voice high with panic. Clayton risked a glance over the ore cart's rim and saw Morrison crouched behind a pile of old mining timbers, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. The man who'd terrorized an entire territory was discovering what it felt like to be the prey instead of the predator. Another rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls, and one of Morrison's men stumbled out from behind his cover clutching a shattered shoulder. The hidden marksmen were good, better than good. They were picking their shots with surgical precision, wounding rather than killing when possible, maximizing chaos while conserving ammunition. "Where are they?" Morrison screamed at his remaining men. "Find them!" A voice rang out from the rocks above, clear and strong, and unmistakably feminine. "Thomas Morrison." Clayton's heart leaped as he recognized Clarabelle's voice, pitched to carry across the entire mine complex. Morrison's head snapped up, his pale eyes searching the heights for the source. "I know you can hear me, Thomas," Clarabelle continued. Your men are dying because of your obsession. How many more will you sacrifice for your wounded pride? Clarabelle. Morrison breathed, and the mixture of rage and possessive hunger in his voice made Clayton's stomach turn. My dear sweet wife, still playing games, I see. I'm not your wife. Clarabelle's voice rang out with absolute conviction. I never was. You bought a terrified girl and tried to break her into submission, but that girl is gone, Thomas, and the woman who stands here now is your enemy. Morrison rose from cover his gun, trained on the rocks where her voice had originated. Come down here and face me, you ungrateful bitch. All of you face me like the whores you are. The response came not in words, but in lead. 5 rifles spoke as one, their muzzle flashes winking from different positions among the rocks. Morrison dove back behind his shelter as bullets chewed splinters from the mining timbers, and Clayton realized with a surge of fierce pride that the women had positioned themselves perfectly to create a crossfire that covered the entire mine complex. Sir, one of Morrison's surviving men called out, we need to pull back. They've got us pinned down. No. Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. We don't retreat from a handful of women. Find a way up those rocks. But his men's discipline was cracking under the sustained fire from an enemy they couldn't locate or effectively return fire against. Another rifle shot rang out, and Clayton heard a man scream as the bullet found its mark. The professional killers Morrison had brought to reclaim his property were being systematically destroyed by 5 women who'd learned to fight for their freedom. Clayton saw his chance and took it. While Morrison was focused on the rocks above, Clayton rolled from behind the ore cart and came up running, heading for a cluster of boulders that would put him closer to Morrison's position. If he could get behind the man in this quickly, Reeves, Morrison's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. I should have known. Clayton spun to find Morrison's gun trained on him, the older man's face twisted with murderous rage. You led us into a trap, you bastard. You're working with them. That's right, Clayton said, his own pistol clearing leather. And proud of it. They fired simultaneously, the 2 reports blending into one thunderous crash that echoed off the canyon walls. Clayton felt something tug at his sleeve as Morrison's bullet passed inches from his arm, while his own shot took Morrison in the shoulder and spun him around like a broken doll. Morrison stumbled but kept his feet, blood spreading across his expensive shirt as he raised his gun for another shot. But before he could fire, another rifle cracked from the rocks above, and Morrison's gun went spinning from his hand as the bullet shattered his wrist. Thomas Morrison, a new voice called out, Grace's voice strong with authority. You're surrounded and outgunned. Surrender now, and we'll let your remaining men live. Morrison clutched his wounded arm, his pale eyes wild with pain and fury. Around the mine complex, his surviving men were looking to him for orders, but the fight had gone out of them. Half their number lay dead or wounded, and their invincible leader was bleeding and disarmed. You think you've won? Morrison snarled, spittle flying from his lips. You think this is over? I own this territory. I own judges, sheriffs, territorial officials. I'll hunt you down like the animals you are. Not anymore, you won't. The new voice came from behind Morrison, and Clayton's heart soared as he saw a tall man in a federal marshal's badge emerge from the rocks, flanked by a dozen heavily armed deputies. Marshal Samuel Hartford had arrived exactly as planned, drawn by the evidence the women had managed to get to him just in time. Morrison spun toward the newcomers, his face going white as he recognized Hartford. Marshal, this is a private matter. This is a federal matter, Hartford interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Thomas Morrison, you're under arrest for corruption, extortion, kidnapping, and about a dozen other charges that'll keep you in prison for the rest of your natural life. You can't prove anything, Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. Actually, we can. Hartford gestured toward the rocks, where the women were beginning to emerge, their rifles still trained on Morrison's surviving men. Thanks to some very brave witnesses and some very thorough documentation. Clayton watched in amazement as Clarabelle, Ruby, Sadie, Violet, and Grace made their way down from their positions. They moved like soldiers, their weapons ready, but disciplined, their faces showing the grim satisfaction of a job well done. But it was Clarabelle who drew his attention, walking tall and proud despite the danger they'd all just faced. When she reached him, Clayton couldn't help himself. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight enough to convince himself she was real and whole and safe. "I was so afraid," he whispered against her hair. "We all were," she whispered back. "But we did it, Clayton. We actually did it." Marshal Hartford was directing his deputies to secure Morrison's men reading charges from a document thick with legal language. Morrison himself stood in stunned silence, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his arrogance. "Margaret Morrison sends her regards," Hartford said to the captive. "Your wife is quite alive, by the way, and quite eager to testify about your business practices. Turns out faking someone's death for insurance money is frowned upon by federal authorities." Morrison's face went gray as old ash. His wife, the woman he'd claimed had died in a carriage accident years ago, was alive and ready to destroy him. The web of lies and violence he'd built his empire on was finally collapsing. "It's over, Thomas," Clarabelle said, her voice carrying not triumph, but weary relief. "Finally, it's over." As the deputies led Morrison and his surviving men away in shackles, Clayton found himself surrounded by 5 remarkable women who'd risked everything for freedom and won. The mine that had been a battlefield moments before was now peaceful again, the only sounds the wind through the rocks and the distant cry of the hawk that had witnessed it all. "What happens now?" Ruby asked, her usual cheerfulness muted by exhaustion. "Now we go home," Grace said simply. "All of us." Clayton looked around at the faces of the women who'd become his family, and at the woman who'd become something even more precious. The cabin waiting for them in the hidden valley wasn't just shelter anymore, it was the foundation of the new life they'd all fought so hard to build. As they gathered their weapons and prepared for the journey back to their mountain sanctuary, Clayton felt the weight of his uncle's legacy settling around his shoulders like a mantle of honor. Jeremiah Reeves had seen injustice and acted to stop it, even knowing the cost. Now his nephew had done the same, and in doing so had found not just his purpose, but his place in the world. The sun was setting behind the mountains as they rode away from the Dutchman's mine, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that promised a new day coming. Behind them lay the wreckage of Thomas Morrison's empire. Ahead lay whatever future they chose to build together. The ride back to the cabin stretched through the gathering dusk, each mile carrying them further from the violence of the mine and closer to the sanctuary that had become their true home. Clayton rode beside Clarabelle, stealing glances at her profile as she gazed ahead toward the mountains that sheltered their valley. The setting sun caught the copper highlights in her hair and painted her face in shades of gold that made his chest tight with emotions he was still learning to name. "You were magnificent back there," he said quietly, his voice meant for her ears alone. Clarabelle turned to look at him, and in her green eyes he saw not triumph but the bone-deep weariness that came after a long war finally ended. "We all were. Ruby's shooting Grace's tactics, Violet's positioning of the ammunition, every one of us did what needed to be done." "Your uncle would be proud," Sadie called from behind them, having overheard. "We honored his memory today." Clayton nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle in his chest like warmth from a well-tended fire. Jeremiah Reeves had set this all in motion, saving 5 women who'd been written off as property and giving his nephew the chance to become something more than a drifter with no purpose. The old man's ghost could rest easy now. As they climbed into the high country where the air grew thin and crystal clear, Ruby began to sing a soft melody that Clayton didn't recognize, but that seemed to capture the mixture of relief and hope that surrounded them like morning mist. Her voice carried across the mountains pure and sweet, and one by one the others joined in. Even Grace, who spoke so rarely of personal things, added her rich alto to the harmony. Clayton found himself thinking about the transformation he'd witnessed in these women over the past week. When he'd first arrived at the cabin, they'd been fugitives hiding from a powerful enemy. Now they rode like conquering heroes returning from a righteous war, their backs straight and their eyes bright, with the knowledge that they'd faced their demons and emerged victorious. "What will you do now?" he asked Clarabelle, as their horses picked their way up a particularly steep section of trail. "With Morrison in prison and your lives your own again, build something lasting," she said without hesitation. "Something that honors what Jeremiah started and what we've all sacrificed to achieve." "The cabin's a good foundation," Clayton said. "Plenty of room to expand, and the land could support a proper ranch operation." Violet guided her horse closer, her eyes bright with the enthusiasm that had sustained her through the darkest moments of their flight. "I've been thinking about that. We could raise horses. Ruby's got a gift with them that's almost magical. And Grace knows enough about medicine to serve the whole mountain community. Sadie's already planning gardens that could feed half the territory," Grace added with one of her rare smiles. "And there's enough timber on that 40 acres to build whatever we need." Clayton felt something expand in his chest as he listened to them plan their future, their shared future built on the foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection he'd never experienced before. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about creating something beautiful from the ashes of what Morrison had tried to destroy. The trail leveled out as they entered the hidden valley, and the familiar sight of the cabin's windows glowing with warm lamplight made Clayton's throat tight with emotion. Someone had been there ahead of them, Marshal Hartford's men probably ensuring the place was secure. But as they rode closer, Clayton saw that it was more than just security that had been provided. A celebration waited for them. The porch was strung with lanterns that cast dancing shadows across the weathered wood, and a dozen horses were tied to the rail, more people than the cabin had ever hosted at one time. As they dismounted, the front door burst open, and Margaret Morrison stepped onto the porch, very much alive and radiant with joy. "Clarabelle," she called, rushing down the steps with her arms outstretched. "My dear, brave girl." The reunion between the two women was like watching sunlight break through storm clouds. They embraced with the fierce affection of sisters, separated by years of lies and violence, tears streaming down both their faces as they held each other tight. "I thought you were dead," Clarabelle whispered. Thomas said many things," Margaret replied, her voice strong despite the tears. "But I've been very much alive and working with Marshal Hartford to gather evidence of his crimes. When we received your uncle's documentation, we finally had everything we needed." Marshal Hartford appeared in the doorway, his stern face softened by genuine warmth. "Ladies, Mr. Reeves, welcome home. I took the liberty of gathering some friends to celebrate your victory." The cabin filled with voices and laughter as the true scope of their triumph became clear. Jeremiah's network of allies had grown far beyond what any of them had imagined. Shopkeepers and ranchers, territorial officials who'd remained honest despite Morrison's influence, even a newspaper editor from Denver who'd been documenting corruption for months. "Your uncle was building something much larger than just evidence against one man," Hartford explained as they gathered around the big table for a feast that seemed to materialize from nowhere. He was creating a network of good people who refused to be intimidated by bullies like Morrison. Samuel Chen, Ruby's father, had made the journey from San Francisco upon hearing of his daughter's freedom. The reunion between father and daughter was tender and joyful, made more precious by the years they'd been separated by Morrison's lies about debts and obligations. "I knew you were strong enough to survive," he said, holding Ruby's hands as if afraid she might disappear again. "But I never imagined you were strong enough to bring down an entire criminal empire." "We had help," Ruby said, her eyes finding Clayton across the room. "Someone who chose to stand with us when he could have walked away." As the evening progressed, Clayton found himself drawn again and again to conversations about the future. Margaret Morrison, who would be reclaiming her maiden name of Stewart, spoke of using her late husband's remaining legitimate assets to fund schools and hospitals throughout the territory. Dr. Chen discussed establishing a medical practice that would serve the scattered mountain communities. The newspaper editor talked about chronicling their story as an example of what ordinary people could accomplish when they stood together against corruption. But it was a quiet conversation with Clarabelle on the porch, away from the celebration inside, that finally made everything clear to Clayton. "This feels like the end of something," he said, looking out at the mountains that had sheltered them through their darkest hours. "It is the end," Clarabelle agreed. "The end of running, of hiding, of living in fear, but it's also the beginning of something much better." "What kind of beginning?" She turned to face him, and in her green eyes, he saw not just affection, but something deeper, a love that had been forged in shared danger and tempered by mutual respect. "The beginning of the life we choose for ourselves, instead of the life someone else forces on us." Clayton reached for her hand, marveling at how perfectly it fit in his. "And what life do you choose, Clarabelle Stewart?" Her smile was radiant as sunrise over the mountains. "One with you, if you'll have me. One where we build something lasting together, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who needs a safe place to start over." "Partners?" Clayton asked. "Partners," she confirmed, "in everything." The celebration continued late into the night, but eventually the guests departed, leaving the 6 members of their chosen family alone in the cabin that had become their fortress and their home. As they cleaned up the remnants of the feast, Clayton found himself watching each woman with new eyes. Ruby moved with the easy grace of someone who'd rediscovered joy, her quick laughter filling spaces that had been haunted by fear for too long. She'd already begun planning the horse breeding operation she wanted to establish, her eyes bright with visions of Arabian stallions and mountain-bred mares that would carry their reputation across the West. Sadie worked with the quiet efficiency that masked a brilliant mind for organization and logistics. She'd spent the evening sketching plans for expanded gardens and greenhouses that would turn their mountain valley into an oasis of plenty. Her dreams reached beyond mere survival to genuine prosperity, shared by everyone who called this place home. Violet hummed as she organized the gifts their guests had brought: books and fabrics, tools and medicines, the building blocks of civilization in a place that had known only wildness before. Her vision encompassed a community center where traveling families could find shelter and children could receive education from people who understood the value of knowledge. Grace moved through the cabin with the authoritative calm of someone born to leadership, already planning the medical practice she would establish. Her experience with Morrison's victims had shown her how much healing was needed in the territory, not just of bodies, but of spirits broken by men like her former captor. And Clarabelle moved like a woman who'd finally come home to herself, every gesture radiating the confidence of someone who'd faced her worst fears and emerged victorious. She was already sketching plans for expansion, for guest quarters that could house the families of patients who needed Grace's care, for workshops where Ruby could train horses and Violet could teach children. "You know," Clayton said as they settled around the dying fire, "when I inherited this place, I thought I was getting 40 acres and a cabin. I had no idea I was getting a family." "Family's not about blood," Grace said quietly. "It's about the people you choose to stand with when everything falls apart. And the people who choose to stand with you," Ruby added, curling up in the chair that had become her favorite spot. "The people who see your strength instead of your scars," Sadie said softly. "The people who help you become who you were always meant to be," Violet concluded. Clarabelle looked around at each of them, her eyes bright with unshed tears of gratitude. "The people who prove that love is stronger than fear and hope is stronger than despair." Clayton felt something settle in his chest as he looked at these 5 remarkable women who'd transformed his entire world in the space of a week. Uncle Jeremiah had left him more than property. He'd left him a chance to become the man he was capable of being, surrounded by people who would challenge him to be better every single day. "So what do we call ourselves now?" Ruby asked with a grin. "We can't keep introducing ourselves as fugitives." "We're the family that Morrison's cruelty created and his defeat set free," Grace said thoughtfully. "We're the family that Jeremiah Reeves believed in before we believed in ourselves," Sadie added. "We're the family that chose love over fear and hope over despair," Violet said. Clarabelle stood and moved to the window, looking out at the valley that would shelter their dreams for years to come. "We're the family that proves some things are worth fighting for," she said simply. Clayton joined her at the window, slipping his arm around her waist as they gazed out at the moonlit mountains together. Behind them, their chosen sisters prepared for sleep in the home they'd all helped defend. Around them, the cabin that had been a refuge was becoming a foundation for something larger and more beautiful than any of them had dared to imagine. "Think we can handle it?" Clayton asked quietly. "Building something this big?" Clarabelle leaned into his embrace, her voice warm with laughter and bright with certainty. "We can handle anything together," she said. "After all, we're the family that brought down Thomas Morrison." And in the peaceful silence of the mountain night, with the woman he loved safe in his arms and his chosen family secure under his roof, Clayton Reeves finally understood the true gift his uncle had left him. Not just land or property, but the chance to discover that the greatest inheritance of all was the courage to fight for the people you love, and the wisdom to recognize that love when it found you. The stars wheeled overhead, in their ancient patterns witnesses to the end of one story and the beginning of another. In the cabin below, 6 people who'd been strangers a week ago settled into sleep as the family they'd chosen to become, bound together by trials that had tested their courage and revealed their strength. Morrison's reign of terror was over, destroyed by 5 women who'd refused to stay broken, and 1 man who'd chosen to stand with them against impossible odds. But more importantly, something beautiful and lasting had been born from their victory, a family forged in fire and tempered by love, ready to build a future worthy of the price they'd paid to claim it. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow, and all the tomorrows that would follow. In the hidden valley where 6 souls had found their true home, the work of building something extraordinary was just beginning, and they would handle it together, as they would handle everything else that life might bring. Because that's what family did, and that's what they had become, and that's what they would always be, unbreakable, unstoppable, and absolutely certain that love was the strongest force in any world worth living in. 3 years had passed since the confrontation at Dutchman's Mine, and the hidden valley that sheltered the Reeves homestead had transformed into something that would have made Uncle Jeremiah proud beyond measure. What had begun as a desperate refuge for 5 fugitive women had grown into a beacon of hope that drew people from across the Colorado Territory and beyond. Clayton stood on the newly built observation deck that crowned the main house, watching the morning sun paint the valley in shades of gold and green. Below him, the original cabin had been expanded into a sprawling complex of buildings that served multiple purposes while maintaining the rustic charm that made this place feel like home. The sound of children's laughter drifted up from the schoolhouse where Violet taught reading and arithmetic, to the sons and daughters of families who'd found sanctuary here, while the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil marked the spot where Ruby worked with the blacksmith they'd hired to shoe the horses that had made their operation famous throughout the West. The Reeves Arabian Ranch, as it had come to be known, raised some of the finest horses in the territory. Ruby's intuitive understanding of equine temperament, combined with bloodstock purchased with money recovered from Morrison's seized assets, had produced animals that were sought after from Denver to San Francisco. But more than that, the ranch had become a place where broken people came to heal former victims of Morrison's network, families displaced by mining disasters, women escaping situations that echoed too closely the horrors the original five had endured. "You're up early," Clarabelle said, joining him on the deck with 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the crisp mountain air. 3 years of marriage had only deepened Clayton's appreciation for the remarkable woman who'd become his partner in every sense of the word. She wore her auburn hair pinned back in the practical style she favored for workdays, and her green eyes held the contentment of someone who'd found her true calling. "Couldn't sleep," Clayton admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Too much to think about." "The letter from the territorial governor," Clayton nodded, his expression serious. The previous week had brought an official invitation that would change everything if they accepted it. Governor Samuel Crawford wanted Clayton to run for the territorial legislature, representing the mountain districts where his reputation for integrity and courage had spread far beyond their valley. "It's a big decision," Clarabelle said, settling beside him on the bench they'd built to catch the morning sun, "but not one you have to make alone." That was the heart of what they'd built here, not just a successful ranch or a thriving community, but a family bound by choice rather than blood, committed to supporting each other through every challenge and celebration life might bring. The decision about Clayton's political future would be made collectively, as all major decisions were, because the lessons they'd learned during their fight against Morrison had taught them that strength came from unity. Below them, the valley was coming alive with the purposeful activity that marked every dawn at the homestead. Grace emerged from the medical clinic she'd established in a converted barn, already dressed for her weekly rounds to the surrounding communities. Her reputation as a healer had grown to legendary proportions, not just for her skill with medicines and surgery, but for her ability to mend spirits as well as bodies. The women she'd helped escape abusive situations often stayed to work at the ranch, finding in Grace's quiet strength the courage to rebuild their lives. Sadie appeared in the doorway of the main kitchen, flour dusting her apron as she supervised the preparation of breakfast for the 37 people who currently called the homestead home. What had started as a simple desire to grow vegetables had evolved into an agricultural operation that fed not only their own people, but much of the surrounding mountain region. Her greenhouses produced fresh food year-round, and her preservation techniques ensured that no one in their valley ever went hungry, even during the harshest winters. Margaret Stewart. She'd legally reclaimed her maiden name after Morrison's conviction had become the financial backbone of their operation. Her careful management of the assets recovered from her late husband's empire had funded not just the expansion of the ranch, but similar safe havens throughout the territory. The Stewart Foundation, as it had come to be known, provided resources for anyone seeking to escape situations of abuse or exploitation. "Remember when our biggest worry was whether Morrison would find us before winter?" Clarabelle asked, her voice warm with shared memory. "Now our biggest worry is whether we're doing enough to help all the people who need what we're offering," Clayton replied. "Sometimes I think Uncle Jeremiah knew exactly what he was starting when he saved you all." "I think he hoped," Clarabelle said thoughtfully, "hoped that if he could save 5 women, those 5 women might save others, and those others might save still more. It's like ripples in a pond. Each act of courage creates the possibility for more courage." The sound of approaching hooves drew their attention to the main trail, where a small group of riders was making its way toward the homestead. Clayton recognized Dr. Chen's distinctive bay gelding in the lead, which meant Ruby's father was making one of his monthly visits from his practice in Colorado Springs. Behind him rode 2 women and a man Clayton didn't recognize, their clothes dusty from hard travel, and their postures speaking of people who'd been running from something. "More refugees," Clarabelle observed, and Clayton heard both sadness and determination in her voice. 3 years of success hadn't eliminated the need for places like their homestead. If anything, their reputation for helping the desperate had increased the number of people who sought them out. They made their way down to greet the newcomers, and Clayton's heart clenched as he saw the familiar signs of abuse in the women's faces. The flinching wariness around sudden movements, the way they positioned themselves to watch all exits, the hollow look in their eyes that spoke of spirits nearly broken by cruelty. The man with them was younger, perhaps a brother or husband who'd helped them escape whatever hell they'd been enduring. Dr. Chen made the introductions with the gentle professionalism that had made him invaluable to their operation. Clayton, Clarabelle, I'd like you to meet the Hendersons, James, Sarah, and Mary. They've traveled from New Mexico territory seeking sanctuary. Sarah Henderson was perhaps 19, with dark hair and eyes that reminded Clayton painfully of how Ruby had looked when he'd first met her, beautiful but haunted, strong but fragile, in the way of things that had been bent nearly to breaking. Her sister Mary was younger, maybe 16, and she stayed close to Sarah's side with the protective instincts of someone who'd learned early that the world could be dangerous for young women. James Henderson was clearly their brother, his resemblance to the women unmistakable, despite the hard lines that anger and worry had carved around his eyes. He carried himself like a man prepared for violence, and Clayton recognized the particular tension that came from feeling responsible for people you couldn't adequately protect. "Welcome," Clarabelle said, her voice carrying the warmth that had made her a natural leader for their community. "You're safe here. Whatever brought you to us, whatever you're running from it, stops at the boundary of this valley." The visible relief that washed over the three newcomers was like watching ice melt in spring sunshine. Sarah Henderson actually swayed on her feet, and Clayton stepped forward quickly to steady her. "When did you last eat?" he asked gently. "Yesterday morning," James said, his voice rough with exhaustion and suppressed emotion. "We didn't dare stop anywhere that might have connections to—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Clayton had heard variations of this story dozens of times over the past 3 years, people fleeing from powerful men who considered them property, who used wealth and influence to hunt down anyone who dared to escape their control. "Ruby," Clarabelle called toward the corrals where Ruby was working with a spirited mare. "Could you help our guests get settled and ask Sadie to prepare some food?" Ruby dropped what she was doing immediately, her face brightening with the joy she always showed when helping newcomers. In the 3 years since Morrison's defeat, she'd become the unofficial welcome committee for refugees, her own experience allowing her to connect with people who were struggling to believe they could ever be truly safe again. As the Hendersons were led toward the guest quarters, Dr. Chen fell into step beside Clayton and Clarabelle. "They're fleeing a situation in Santa Fe," he said quietly. "Man named Cornelius Blackwood, territorial judge with connections throughout the Southwest. Similar pattern to what we saw with Morrison, but possibly worse." Clayton felt familiar anger rising in his chest. How much worse? Blackwood specializes in young women from immigrant families. Dr. Chen said, his professional composure not quite hiding his disgust. "Targets people who don't speak English well, who don't understand the legal system, uses forged documents and manufactured debts to trap them in what amounts to slavery. And the local authorities, either bought or intimidated. Blackwood's been operating for nearly a decade, and no one's been able to touch him." Clarabelle's green eyes had taken on the steely determination that Clayton knew meant she was already planning a campaign. "What kind of evidence would it take to bring him down?" "The same kind we gathered against Morrison," Dr. Chen said. "Documentation, witness testimony, proof of corruption that even his bought judges couldn't ignore. But it would be dangerous. Blackwood has enforcers who make Morrison's men look like choir boys." Clayton looked out across the valley where their chosen family had built something beautiful from the ashes of their own suffering, and he felt the familiar call to action that had led him to stand with 5 desperate women 3 years ago. The work wasn't finished, would never be finished, as long as men like Morrison and Blackwood existed to prey on the vulnerable. "We'll need to discuss this with the others," he said finally. "Decide whether we're ready to take on another fight like the one that brought us together." That evening, the core family gathered around the same table where they'd planned Morrison's downfall, but the atmosphere was different now. They were no longer desperate fugitives gambling everything on a single desperate gambit. They were established leaders of a community that depended on them for guidance and protection. Grace had examined the Henderson sisters and confirmed what they'd all suspected: signs of systematic abuse that went far beyond mere physical violence. "Blackwood's operation is sophisticated," she reported. "Medical examinations as a form of intimidation, drugs to ensure compliance, psychological manipulation designed to convince his victims they deserve what's happening to them." Violet had spent the afternoon interviewing James Henderson, and her report painted a picture of corruption that reached from Santa Fe to Washington, D.C. "Blackwood's been operating with impunity because he's careful about who he targets, and he has protection at every level of government. But James has been documenting everything: names, dates, financial records. He's been planning to expose Blackwood for months." Ruby had focused on the practical aspects of rescue and shelter. "There are at least 20 women still trapped in Blackwood's operation," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Maybe more, and he's been expanding, setting up similar operations in Arizona and California." Sadie had been researching the financial aspects of Blackwood's empire using connections Margaret had maintained throughout the territorial business community. "He's wealthier than Morrison ever was," she reported, "but that wealth is built on fraud and extortion, just like Morrison's was. If we can prove the criminal activity, we can seize his assets just like we did before." Margaret herself had been consulting with federal authorities, using her position on the Stewart Foundation board to make inquiries about Blackwood's activities. "Marshall Hartford is interested," she said, "but he needs more evidence than James Henderson can provide alone. He needs multiple witnesses and documentation that would stand up in federal court." Clayton listened to each report, feeling the weight of leadership settle on his shoulders like a familiar cloak. The decision they faced wasn't just about helping the Henderson family, it was about whether they were willing to risk everything they'd built to take on another monster who preyed on the innocent. "What are our chances?" he asked finally. "Better than they were with Morrison," Grace said thoughtfully. "We have resources now, connections, experience. We know how to plan and execute this kind of operation." "But the risks are higher too," Violet pointed out. "We're not desperate fugitives with nothing to lose anymore. We have a community to protect people who depend on us." "Which is exactly why we have to act," Ruby said fiercely. "Because if we don't stop men like Blackwood, how many more families like the Hendersons will suffer?" Clarabelle had been quiet throughout the discussion, but now she stood and moved to the window that looked out over the valley where their chosen family had found peace and purpose. "Jeremiah didn't save us so we could live comfortable lives while others suffered," she said quietly. "He saved us so we could become the kind of people who save others." "The territorial governor's invitation," Clayton said suddenly, pieces of a larger plan beginning to form in his mind. "If I run for the legislature, I'd have legal standing to investigate Blackwood's operations, official authority to demand documents, question witnesses. And we'd have a legitimate reason to be in Santa Fe," Sadie added, understanding immediately where his thoughts were leading. "A base of operations that wouldn't arouse suspicion," Violet continued. "Legal protection for witnesses who agree to testify," Grace concluded. Margaret smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun. The Stewart Foundation could provide funding for a fact-finding mission about territorial corruption, completely above board, completely legal. Clayton looked around the table at five faces that had become as familiar and dear to him as his own reflection, and he saw in their expressions the same determination that had carried them through their darkest hours. They'd built something beautiful in this valley, but they'd built it with the understanding that their own safety meant nothing if others continued to suffer as they had suffered. "Then we're doing this," he said, and it wasn't a question. "We're doing this," Clarabelle confirmed, and her voice carried the authority of someone who'd learned to lead by standing up to the worst humanity had to offer. Over the following weeks, the homestead transformed once again, not physically but in purpose and energy. The comfortable rhythms of ranch life gave way to the focused intensity of planning another impossible mission. James Henderson proved to be a valuable ally, his detailed knowledge of Blackwood's operations providing the foundation for a strategy that would expose the judge's crimes while protecting his victims. The Hendersons weren't the only refugees who'd found their way to the valley in recent months. Word of their sanctuary had spread throughout the Southwest, carried by former victims who'd found the courage to escape their situations. Each new arrival brought fresh intelligence about Blackwood's network, painting a picture of corruption that reached far beyond what any of them had initially imagined. Clayton accepted the governor's invitation and began preparing for a political campaign that would serve as cover for their real mission. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 years ago, he'd been a nobody drifter with no prospects and no purpose. Now, he was preparing to seek elected office as part of a plan to bring down one of the most powerful men in the territory. But the most significant change came in his relationship with Clarabelle. The partnership they'd forged in crisis had deepened into something that went beyond love or marriage. They'd become two halves of a single will, united in purpose and absolute in their trust of each other. "Are you afraid?" she asked one evening as they sat on their observation deck watching the stars emerge in the crystal mountain air. Terrified, Clayton admitted, just as he had 3 years ago, but not of Blackwood. What then? Of not being worthy of what Uncle Jeremiah started, of failing the people who've trusted us to protect them. Clarabelle took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in the gesture that had become their private signal of solidarity. "Do you remember what I told you the night before you rode to Colorado Springs? About strength not being the absence of fear, but doing what's right, despite the fear." "I remember. That's what we're doing now, what we've always been doing. And as long as we face it together, as long as we remember why we're fighting, we can't fail." Clayton squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her certainty. Below them, the valley sheltered the community they'd built. From nothing, the families they'd saved, the dreams they'd made real through sheer determination and mutual support. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new opportunities to prove that justice was more than just a word. But tonight, surrounded by the love and loyalty of his chosen family, Clayton Reeves felt ready for whatever came next. They'd faced down Thomas Morrison and his army of killers. They'd built something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of their victory. And now they would do it again, because that's what family did for each other and for anyone who needed their protection. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of tomorrow's possibilities and the promise that some things were always worth fighting for. In the hidden valley where 6 souls had found their true purpose, the work of building a better world continued, one rescued life at a time, one act of courage building upon another, until the ripples reached every corner of a territory that desperately needed heroes. And they would be those heroes together for as long as breath remained in their bodies and justice remained undone in their world.